Okay, we're going to get started with, keep on going with this problem and get started with part 3, which remember is calculating the p-value using your z-score from your test statistic. So again, you want to reference that formula that we had our previous video on as we're going through this and looking at it on your notes as you're watching this video. So that first part of the test statistic is going to be P1 minus P2. So we have P1 minus P2. There we go. So P1 minus P2. And we get those values based off our proportion from our samples. So that came out to 0.48 and 0.55. We already calculated those. So that's how we get those numbers and plug those numbers into our formula. And this should have a p hat there because it's our sample proportion. So we subtract them from each other. That's how we get that first number on the top. Our second number is going to be always 0 because we're comparing it against if there was no difference. So if there was no difference between these two different proportions and they were the same, then if we subtracted them, our result would be 0. So that's why we're always going to put 0 as that second number on the top. Then on the bottom, we have our standard deviation. Now this part is a little bit tricky, so make sure you're paying very close attention to this next part as I'm explaining it. So remember in our formula, we're not going to take our sample proportion from each sample. Instead, we're going to use our null hypothesis proportion. So essentially that is what the proportion would be if there is no difference. So in order to get that, we are going to combine our results from our different samples. So let's look over here. So our number of people that supported Obama was 120. The number of people that voted for or supported Obama for the women was 132. So we add those together to combine them. Same thing with the sample size. We combine those. That gives us 252 out of 490, which gives us a proportion of 51:43. Okay, so for the significant test only, we have to do this for our standard deviation. So we go back, look over here. That's how we get that 0.5143. This number right here. And then to get the 0.4857, we get that from subtracting 1, doing 1 minus 0.5143. Now if you notice on the bottom, we still put the different sample sizes from the different samples. So we had a sample size of 250 for the men and 240 for the women. So those numbers will change, but the top will always stay the same for these significance tests. Now, we just use order of operations to calculate that out. Use your graphing calculator to do that. Since this problem already is pretty long, I'll let you try to figure that out on your own. If you're having trouble, I would just talk with your people at your table and they'll probably be able to help you make sure that you get the right number. On the top, we just do the 0.48 minus 0.55, which is negative 0.07, which in this case, since the second number represents the proportion from the women, that means that 7% more women voted for or supported Obama than men. Again, that's why we want to make sure that we're writing down what P1 and P2 represents to help us figure out and do that interpretation as we're going through this whole problem. Because if we don't, see there's a lot of numbers and get really confusing at the end when we're trying to interpret it. Then we still have that 0, so no calculations there. And then our standard deviation should come out to 0.0452. So we calculate that out and it comes out to a z-score of negative 1.55. Remember, for just regular z-scores, we only need to include 2 decimal places. If you want to include more, that's fine, but for all these example problems, I'm only going to include 2. So then we got to convert our z-score to a p-value. And remember, anytime we're converting to a p-value, we're always going to find the tail value of the curve. So if it's the negative z-score, we're going to find the left tail. If it's a positive z-score, we're going to find the right tail. In this case, we have a negative z-score right here. So that means we're going to find that left tail. So our lower boundary is going to be negative infinity. So we put negative 1,000 to represent that in our calculator. And our upper boundary is going to be negative 1.55, our z-score. And I forgot to write this down beforehand, but we want to make sure we're writing out this calculator command. We write that down as our z-score. So we plug that into our calculator. That comes out to 0.0606. So that's our p-value, but let's go back to our hypotheses. Remember, this is a not equal to sign right here. So that means that it's going to be a two-sided test, which means at the very end, when we have our p-value, we have to multiply that p-value we calculated by 2 because it is a two-sided test, which gives us a p-value of 0.1212. Now we're going to finish up with our interpretation. So since our p-value of 0.1212 is higher than our significance level of 0.05, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. We do not have statistically significant evidence to suggest there is a difference in support for Obama between men and women. So again, that interpretation, just like our last unit, that first sentence you want to include whether you're rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis based off the p-value and significance level. And then the second sentence needs to be talking about in context what that means. So again, you should be able to have that second sentence and present it to somebody who doesn't know anything about statistics, and they're able to understand what the results of the study are. And those are all 4 parts of the significance test. I know these problems are very long, but you really just want to make sure that you're breaking it down to each of those 4 parts and it becomes a lot more manageable.